All right, so Acts chapter 25, we'll be looking at verses 13 through 27 this morning. And again, I want to bring us up to these verses in the life of Paul. Of course, Paul comes on the scene, what is it, about the end of chapter 7 or 8? I think it's the end of chapter 7. He comes on the scene. He's a zealous Pharisee. And in chapter 9, Christ meets him on the road to Damascus, and he believes on Christ and becomes his follower, his disciple. Through various events, he begins traveling and taking the gospel to other cities and towns, and eventually to the Gentiles. He takes what we would call his first missionary journey with Barnabas. And I don't know if he called it a missionary journey, but now, 2,000 years later, we look back on it and call it a missionary journey. His second missionary journey went with Silas, and then Timothy and Luke joined him on that. And then his third missionary journey, he is collecting funds for the Christians back in Jerusalem. And he's going to drop those off there before he returns to Antioch, where he was sent out from. And when he gets to Jerusalem, toward the end of his third journey, the church leaders there, of course, Paul, his work has been, people are talking about it, and what he's done comes back to Jerusalem with other visitors and what we would call people on pilgrimage back to Jerusalem. And so the church leaders ask him to go through a Jewish ritual that's not really related to our sins being forgiven or anything like that. It's another ritual, and he sees no problem with following that. And on the seventh day, or near the end of the week, when he was about to finish that, he was in the temple, and the Jews mob him. A mob of Jews mob him, try to kill him. The Roman captain rescues him. He gets a chance to talk to the Jews, all the huge crowd there, and they listen intently until he mentions that God had told him to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. They're very prejudicial people, especially at that time. And then the next day, the captain brings him before the Sanhedrin to figure out what the big deal is about him. And the Sanhedrin erupts in a partisan argument between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. There's a plot uncovered to kill Paul. And so the captain in Jerusalem sends him by night down to Caesarea, which is the seat of government, the Roman seat of government for the province there. And at that point, the province is being governed by Felix. And the Sanhedrin hires a New York lawyer, and they go down. Tertullus goes down there. I don't know if he was actually from New York or not, but my youth pastor growing up always talked about New York lawyers. I don't know. He's just like, you'd start to give an excuse, and he said, don't start talking like a New York lawyer. So that's where that comes from in my history. Side note, that's not related to Acts at all. Sorry. Anyway, Tertullus brings all these fancy arguments before Felix, but Felix, while there's no proof for those arguments, Felix doesn't throw the case out as probably he should. He kind of postpones it and says, "Well, I need to hear from the chief captain, from Lysias or Lysias, or however you say his name." And actually, he had already had a letter from him and knew what he thought, but he just leaves him bound. And actually, Paul stays bound. Most people believe that he's not in like hard imprisonment, but he is under the watch of a soldier. He doesn't have full freedom to just leave. And so he's there in Caesarea for about 2 years. Felix is a very hard governor, and after a while, he's removed from office, and Festus comes into office, and that's what we talked about last week. Festus comes into office. He arrives in Caesarea. 3 days later, he goes up to Jerusalem. That's where all the activity, all the unrest in his province kind of comes from that area. So he goes there right away, wants to find out what's going on. Not long after he's there, first thing on the chief priest and ruler's mind is Paul. Still wanting to get rid of him. And there, through Festus, we have the account of him talking to them. Then later on, he talks about it. And then here in this portion, actually twice in this portion of Scripture, Festus refers to this meeting with them again. Maybe it's also the meeting that he actually had with them. But anyway, they're crying out for Paul's death. They want him to die. It's very clear they want him to die. And Festus, like the good Roman, says, we don't execute people without hearing them, and puts them off. They say, well, just bring him up here and let's take care of this right now. He puts them off from that. He says, I'll be down in Caesarea not that long. Of course, they wanted to kill him en route, to kill Paul en route. And anyway, so the Jews try to get the new governor, Festus, to condemn Paul. And then when he gets there, Paul, they bring the same old arguments with no proof. All Paul has to do is say, there's no proof. I deny all these arguments. There's no evidence on either side, and Paul is the one accused, so the ones accusing are supposed to be the ones with evidence. Festus says, well, this is way different than what I thought. I thought this was going to be, I thought this was going to be about laws and things like this, and these are religious questions, things that would probably maybe better answered in Jerusalem. And he wanted to please the Jews. He's a new governor. He wants to make everything work well. So he says to Paul, would you be willing to go to Jerusalem and be tried there? Maybe there's evidence there. I'll be there. I'll be overseeing it. You'll be safe. And Paul says, no. He says, you can't condemn me for something that I haven't done. I appeal to Caesar. And so as a Roman citizen, he had that privilege, that right to have his case, a capital case, which would mean a case where his life was in danger, heard by Caesar himself. And so Festus confers with his council, and they say, this is a capital case. I don't know the details, but I'm assuming they say, yep, this is a capital case. If we take it back there, they may condemn him to die. And he has the right for this case to be heard by Caesar. So he can go to Caesar. And so he announces that he will go. And so in verse 13, we pick up the account. It says, after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. So who is King Agrippa and Bernice? King Agrippa is the last of the Herodian dynasty, or the Herodian kingly line. Herod the Great was the first one, and he is the king who was in Jerusalem. He's the king that we read about in Matthew 2, 1 through 16. He's the man who was king when Jesus was born. He's the one that, there's another king of the Jews. The wise men come to him and say, we're looking for the king of the Jews who was born. And he says he's the king of the Jews. That was part of his whole, it's part of his, I wouldn't say strategy, but that's the word I'm going to have to use right now, of gaining power. He became the king of the Jews. And of course, then he's the one that kills all the infants in Bethlehem, 2 years and under. He has several sons. He kills some of his sons. He kills some of his wives because he as he gets older and older, he's just like suspicious of everybody. One that he didn't kill was Aristobulus. Aristobulus then has a son called Agrippa. Aristobulus' son, Herod the Great's grandson, Agrippa, is the king that we see in Acts chapter 12. He's the king that took James's life, chopped his head off. He's the king that put Peter in jail, and then, the angel got Peter out of jail. He's the king who made the great speech, and people said, oh, it's the voice of a God, and he died. Okay? Well, when he dies, his son Agrippa is in Rome. He's only 17 years old, and so he's too young to take over his father's position. And so the province, Rome, turns it into just a Roman province with a governor or something like that. But a few years later, Agrippa's brother, Herod, this Agrippa's uncle, died, and he was the king of an area just north of that area. And so this is maybe 4 years later, he's 21. So this Agrippa becomes the king of Chalcis or Chalcis. But in that position, he was also given the position of curator of the temple. So he's the one who had control of the temple. Even though the temple was in Judea, not really close to where his kingdom was, he was given that privilege, that authority, that responsibility to watch over the operations, whatever happens in the temple. I'm sure he wasn't there on a weekly basis, but he's the one who had the direct authority to appoint who would be the high priest and make rules and regulations about when they could even wear their actual high priestly garments and all of that type of thing. So he's very much connected with the temple rule, or with what's going on with the temple, by having this position. A few years later, the emperor exchanges his kingship of this small realm of Chalcis for the tetrarchy of Philip. A little bit later, it's added onto that, the tetrarchy of Varus. And then Nero adds on some Galilean cities, including Tiberias, and some Perean cities. So his kingdom is growing just by being assigned different things. And Agrippa is viewed as an authority on the Jewish religion. His dad, or his great-grandfather, Herod the Great, I'm pretty sure was an Idumean, but he had married a Jewish lady so that he could be king of the Jews. So then Aristobulus and Agrippa the first. This Agrippa's mother took a profound interest in the Jewish religion, and so he must have been also interested in it, or she taught him much about it. He's viewed, and you can see the way Festus talks to him, as an authority, as like he would know what's going on in this. And he also, in one sense, did conform or ascribe that he was following, at least in a little way here or there, the Jewish religion. So who's Bernice? Bernice is the oldest daughter of Herod Agrippa the first. Okay? She's the oldest daughter. She's the sister of Drusilla. Now, we heard about Drusilla back in May. Drusilla was Felix's wife. Okay? You got it? Not Festus' wife. Festus took Felix's place. Drusilla was Felix's wife, Bernice's sister. Bernice is 1 year younger than Agrippa, so brother and sister. There's Agrippa, then Bernice, and I don't know, there's another sister, I think, and then there's Drusilla. But Bernice is sister of Agrippa, 1 year younger than he is. And she had been engaged to Marcus, and you don't know all these people, but Marcus was the nephew of Philo. And if you know a little bit, Philo is very famous. We still have his works, Roman philosopher. So these are people that move in, in whatever, big circles. So she was engaged to the nephew of Philo. Then she was married to an uncle. This is the family of Herod, don't forget. Married to an uncle who was the king of Chalcis before her brother became king of Chalcis. But when he died, she moved in with Agrippa. This is the family of Herod, don't forget. Now, there were many rumors of this, whatever you want to call it, arrangement, brother and sister living together in Rome and in Palestine. And so to get rid of those rumors, which most believe the rumors are true, in fact, we pretty much don't just surmise, they were true. But she marries the King Polemo of Cilicia. Cilicia is north of that area. But here's the thing. Her brother, Agrippa, again, being Jewish, required that the king undergo the Jewish rite of circumcision before he would allow this king to marry his sister. So he's interested in, he's a Jew. Not a very good one, but he is. That was in 63 AD. By the time, 63, yes. By the time 66 comes along, she leaves him and moves back in with her brother. Then, she's a nice lady. She's an awful lady. But then Titus comes into town. Titus is the Roman general. He comes into town with the Roman army, and she becomes his mistress. Titus is going to become emperor in a few years. And her relationship with Titus was a public scandal in Rome. Even Rome was like, no, that won't work. And so Titus had to just kind of send her away and get her out of his life. Otherwise, he would lose points toward actually becoming the emperor. Somebody, arguments about who should be the next emperor would be, well, Titus has that Bernice lady around. We don't want that. So he had to send her away. And then he actually does become emperor. So she is quite an intriguing lady. Anyway, Agrippa and Bernice are there. They come, and they're there to welcome Festus to the neighborhood. After certain days, they came to salute Festus. And in verse 14, and when they'd been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priest and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. And we remember that from last week. To whom I answered, it's not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. So Festus just relates the situation that we reviewed before and talked about last week. Verse 17, therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the next day or on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation or none accusation of such things as I supposed. He thought he broke some laws, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition. And superstition is kind of a hard word for us today, but it's just the way they talk. It's the word that he used there in Greek is the same word that he would have talked about his own religion. So he said, this is a question about their religion, not my religion. He used the same word. So it's not, we think of superstition as people that are way off and weird, but not necessarily in this case. And of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And he's a pagan. There's this guy that's dead. Paul said he was alive. I think he's kind of thinking, because if you think back of what he said, well, anyway, he might just be thinking, these people think he's dead. Paul says he's still alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, he says, I don't know about those kind of questions, religious things. I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, now why does he say Augustus? The first Roman emperor was Julius, and he took the name Caesar, Julius Caesar. After that, all the emperors called themselves Caesar. The second emperor was Octavius Augustus. Augustus, which means like august, worship, it's a term of worship. And so then all the Caesars after Octavius, Augustus, used the title Augustus also. So this is, he's not referring to the one from when Jesus was born. This is actually Nero is the Caesar at this time. But he says, to be reserved unto Augustus, I commanded him to be kept until I might send him to Caesar, which is another title. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Festus replies, tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. So let's just a couple things to just pull out of this. I think we should note that in the argument, Festus is just talking about what happened, but he describes it in a certain way, and it's really accurate, and it still is true today. In the argument, the accusers, those that didn't believe, they had what? certain questions. So unbelievers always want to ask questions. And Paul affirmed. Paul said, this happened. This is truth. So in these arguments or whatever, discussions, the unbelievers are always going to, but what about this? And what about this? You could take any topic that people don't believe about. The unbelievers aren't going to come to you with the truth. They're going to come with questions. Say, yeah, but what about this? You say the Bible is inspired, but what about this? And what about this? You say the Bible is preserved, but what about this? And what about this? So the questioners, those that don't believe, are always going to bring questions. They don't have anything that they affirm except that they don't. And they have questions as their support. And Paul just says, he's alive. And it's true. So believers have the truth. Unbelievers have questions. And also, in this, the unbelievers, the chief priests, they had questions about their religion, about their superstition, about this and about this and about this. And Paul said, Jesus is alive. So the believers, their arguments, their support is many times centered in a person, in the person of Jesus Christ. And unbelievers are asking questions about religion and these types of things. And then we see that Herod Agrippa is interested. We kind of get the idea that he'd heard about this, and he'd heard about Paul. It wouldn't be surprising that he'd heard about Paul, and here's an opportunity to hear about the case. So then, on the morrow, verse 23, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, we see them together in Scripture, I think, all the time, with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city. At Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. So Agrippa and Bernice are there. Of course, Festus is there. So we have king and queen. We have a governor. We have the chief captains. These are the men that are over 1,000 soldiers. Lysias was the chief captain in Jerusalem. So these are the captains of 1,000. The principal men of the city of Caesarea. I say, well, who's the principal? Well, Caesarea is the most important city in the whole region, in the whole area. So these are some important men. And then Paul. And Paul comes later, we see Paul comes in chains. So it's just an interesting view there. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all men which are here present with us, this is verse 24. You see this man about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death. Now that's something that Luke is telling us over and over and over again through the book of Acts. Christianity has done nothing wrong. Okay, we see this over and over. You think before all of these Roman rulers, all the rulers of that day, all pronounced Paul and even Jesus not guilty, innocent. He's done nothing worthy of death, and that he himself has appealed to Augustus, I've determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seems to me unreasonable, it does to me too, to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. So, I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Let's just explain that for a second, because last week we talked about how the council said he can be sent to Caesar. So he and his council were correct in allowing him to appeal to Caesar because the Jews wanted him dead. If he went to Jerusalem, there's a high likelihood, this was a capital crime, and Paul is able to, it was a capital accusation, and Paul is able to say, if they're going to take my life, you can't deliver me to them and let them take my life. I appeal to Caesar. That was all within Paul's rights, all within, and Festus was correct to see that this man needs to be able to go to Caesar. But he had no good reason. When he goes to tell Caesar, what's he going to say? This guy believes in a resurrection, and the Jews think he should die. Caesar says, this is Rome. We have laws. You don't just send some guy to me. He's afraid. He's going to, don't just send some guy to me who hasn't at least been accused of something that he should die for in a Roman court of law. I don't know what he actually ends up writing, but this is why. So on Paul's behalf, Paul is about to die. These people want him to die, so it's proper for him to go. As a ruler, though, as the governor, he says, I got to tell my Lord what he's done, what these accusations are. And every time I try to write out what it is, it doesn't make any sense at all. And I don't see any way it's going to make any sense to him either. So I need your help. Please listen to this case, and afterward we'll talk and figure out what it is. So again, this week we have kind of just filled in, and next week we begin Paul's testimony, his most lengthy testimony and most thorough, and it'll be exciting, I think. I think this stuff is interesting, but it's more exciting to hear Paul talk about his life and his conversion, and we'll be looking at that beginning next week. Let's pray together. Father, thank you.